From New York to our Bloomberg television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. This is where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Weston. We begin today with a check on the markets and Abigail Doolittle. So, Abigail, you just can't keep these markets down, and it looks like we're continuing that rotation into cyclicals.
Right on both points, David. It is really a risk-on situation here, which again feels very surprising relative to what we have going on here in the U.S. It simply does not seem to fit. Nonetheless, we have stocks up for a fourth day. At this point, we have the S&P 500 and the Dow both up more than 1%. You're mentioning that move into the cyclicals. There's this feeling that that is bullish. There's also a feeling behind that has a lot to do with reopening optimism. You see that the industrials up more than 3%, the banks up nearly 4%. The banks today also being helped out by the fact that haven bonds are really dropping off. The 10-year yield backing up by 6 basis points right now, back above its 50-day moving average in a pretty convincing manner, David. That's the first time that's happened since 2016, suggesting that maybe investors, folks, are going to start moving out of bonds. If that happens, that could be the next big rotation possibility to keep an eye on, out of bonds and into stocks. Should that occur, it would suggest this rally that we're seeing may just have legs and continue.
Yeah, but take the flip side of that, Abigail. It's a really good point. If, in fact, we don't have a rotation out of bonds, does that say something where the equity markets are headed?
It could indeed, because equity investors are certainly always watching bonds. When bonds are in rally mode, as occurred at one point last year, there were a lot of folks who were reluctant to get into stocks because they were curious as to knowing what bonds were telling them, and that was true too in the summer of 2018. So if we see bonds sort of stagnate here, that may suggest that the rally that we've seen for stocks will stagnate. Right now, it is largely about the dollar. That is tied into, of course, bonds as well, but the dollar has been weak. So as we have yield simply rising here, the dollar has been going down, the yield curve steepening, supporting that. As we've had the dollar go down over the last several days, David, that has helped out the S&P 500. But that's a great point that you make, because if the move out of bonds doesn't really gain steam, that could suggest that the rally here is capped. It's going to be interesting to see. But the thing that stands out the most, continues to stand out the most, is the fact that you have stocks simply climbing, even though it doesn't feel right, doesn't match not only what has been going on with the pandemic and the economic situation, but certainly the social unrest here in the U.S., even though it is perhaps improving right now, David.
Yeah, right now the news is not making a big difference to the markets. Thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report. But there is a lot of news at the same time. Of course, we have this civil unrest continuing throughout the country, although it was a little less violent last night. President Trump, of course, has had an aggressive response to these riots and these demonstrations, which has brought a lot of criticism, and not all of it just from Democrats. We welcome now Jeannie Zaino. She is our Bloomberg political contributor and, of course, a political science professor at Iona College. Jeannie, great to have you with us as always. Are the Republicans distancing themselves maybe a little bit from President Trump on his aggressive stance?
Yeah, we have seen, it's been, I would say, a muted response on the part of Republicans, although we have seen some take exception, particularly to him standing for the photo op with the Bible in front of the church in Lafayette Square. People like James Langford. But again, the response has been particularly muted, I would describe it as. We have seen some others, particularly in the religious community on the right, say a Pat Robertson, who was a bit critical of the president for that same photo op. We even heard the Pope speak out. So there has been criticism. It's coming from both sides, but certainly it is a lot louder and a lot more critical coming from the left than it is, especially from senators in the Republican side.
So, Jeannie, you got your start in polling, as I recall. So talk to us about particularly the Monmouth poll about right track, wrong track. One that I tend to take a look at with respect to incumbents, 74% wrong track. That's a high number for President Trump.
It's a very high number. Yeah, we had two really important polls out. One is the Monmouth that you talked about. The other one is the Politico. In both cases, you see large numbers of voters saying the country is on the wrong track. 7 in 10 voters in the Politico, and you just mentioned the Monmouth. And as we look at the recent Reuters survey about handling of the protest, it's 33% approval. That's just 1/3 to almost 56% disapproval. So these numbers are certainly going in the wrong direction for the president. But that said, I think we have to be a little bit careful about these right track, wrong track polls. this has been sort of the standard in the modern presidency. Both Barack Obama, Bill Clinton were reelected with really high wrong track numbers, and I think we all remember, if we're old enough, those elections. So, it's not something that is going to necessarily hold the president back. It's certainly not what the campaign wants to see. Probably the more important number for the election is his approval rating. And while that has always been fairly mixed, it has not moved that much despite the pandemic and his response to it, and now despite this issue with the rioting and the looting and his handling of this crisis out of Minneapolis. So that has remained fairly steady. And when you talk to the campaign, that's something they consistently want to focus on. And also, most important to remember is that this election will be decided in swing states, and those polls are either Biden ahead or they're fairly close, but certainly the president is not out in those states by any stretch of the imagination.
Exactly. I mean, it's way too soon to tell. We need to look at likely voters, but it looks like almost a jump ball, relatively speaking, right now for the two of them. So let's go over to the other side of the court. Let's talk about former Vice President Joe Biden. He's been relatively quiet. Yesterday, he did come out and make a statement in Philadelphia in a church. What is the proper Biden response? Is he going to change his campaign in response to what's happening across the country?
Yeah, he came out in Philadelphia at the City Hall yesterday. It's one of the real first times he's gotten widespread attention. I think it was covered, the speech he gave was covered on all the cable news shows, and it was a good moment for Biden. It was a particularly strong and powerful speech. And also, if we recall, the reason Biden said he was running for president was because of the racist violence in Charlottesville and what he saw as the president's problematic response to it. That was the whole reason for him to run. So this really was something that is very close to him, and I thought it was a particularly good speech. He talked about the fact he wants to focus on unifying the country, not dividing it, and this is an interesting theme for him because even people on the left have criticized Biden, saying he's not taking a strong enough hand when he talks about being a unifier, and yet at this moment, as we see so much of the widespread protests and the division across the country, it does fit for him to be talking about the president's role is to unify the country and to move forward, and that's what he's been talking about his entire campaign. We only have 5 months until the election, if you can believe it. It's a long time, but it's stunning that it's one of the first times we've seen Biden get this amount of coverage because of the pandemic. He's been basically in his house like so many of us.
Jeannie, can Vice President Biden really take a strong stance as a unifier, as you say, without it appearing he's going soft on violence? Because everybody agrees some of what's been going on in these demonstrations, some of the looting and the violence has not been appropriate. There's a lot of peaceful demonstrators exercising their First Amendment rights, but there appear to be some bad apples in there. Does he have a problem if President Trump sticks with a law and order theme?
I think it's possible for him to do it, and I think he started to do it in his speech yesterday when he tied the president's words and actions, but particularly the president's rhetoric, the talk about vicious dogs, the talk about when the looting starts, the shooting stops, looting starts, the shooting starts. He tied them to a racist past in the United States that's particularly painful for many, many Americans, most Americans. And so he can, I think, walk this line between condemning any act of violence, but also tying the president's rhetoric to this racist past and saying that the president, as Biden said yesterday, this pain is real, and the president needs to be part of the solution and not the problem. And as he recounted some of what the president has been doing in the wake of these riots, he described what he saw as somebody who is part of the problem, and his rhetoric on Twitter and elsewhere he used as examples of that. So I do think it's possible. I think it's also going to impact what Biden does going forward by way of choosing a vice president and other steps he takes in his campaign. So I think we sort of have to take a wait-and-see attitude. But I think he got off to a good start on this yesterday.
So, Jeannie, finally, we have a huge issue, obviously, right now in this country. By the way, it's not a new issue. It's been around for an awful long time that we've not properly addressed, in my opinion at least. At the same time, what's going to go on with the economy come November? And this is my central question. Right now, the economy is in very bad shape, but there is indication that maybe it may be coming back, and certainly the markets are doing particularly well. If come November, the economy certainly isn't where it was before the pandemic, but it's on its way up, and we're really cutting unemployment, things like that. Will that cut in President Trump's favor?
It will, and it's so fascinating to hear you and Abigail just talking a few moments ago about stocks climbing. And in some ways, you look at the market and you look what's going on the ground politically in the U.S., and it's almost like you're living in two different worlds. And I do think that there are signs that the president can benefit from. For instance, we are likely to see unemployment go down. Bloomberg was just reporting the number of cases in New York of COVID going down. The people looking at the markets are feeling optimistic that we have, reached a point at which COVID is going to start to go down and we can start to reopen the economy. As unemployment goes down, the president is politically going to take advantage of that, and he's going to take credit for that. And we do have some economists saying that by November, the numbers could look pretty good in his favor. So I think the Democrats are going to try hard to say that this was something of a self-inflicted wound, that had he acted earlier, had he acted in a different way, we might not have had to take the rough step we did of shutting down the economy in the way we did and going through all this pain. But I do think it's a fair question, and this is what the president is hoping, that by this third quarter, as we get into November, those jobs numbers and other numbers in the economy look good, and there's a chance that they will, or they look better, and he can make the case that he's responsible for it, and there's more to come.
Jeannie, always a treat to have you with us. That's Jeannie Zaino. She's our political contributor and also a professor at Iona College. Coming up here, we're going to go over to the Pentagon because the Secretary of Defense today, Mark Esper, said that he really didn't think it was a good idea for the president to send in federal troops to quell the civil unrest. We'll talk with our national defense correspondent. He is Bill Ferries. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, the Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, surprised quite a few of us today. In a briefing, he said that he disagreed with President Trump in his suggestion that maybe they should send in federal troops to quell some of the civil unrest across the country. In the meantime, he's now been summoned to the White House. We don't know why. It wasn't on the public schedule, but there might be some other reason for it. To explain this all to us now, as far as we know, it is Bill Ferries. He heads up our national security team at Bloomberg. So, Bill, what do we know about what's going on?
Well, we know that Mark Esper and Pentagon leadership have been heavily criticized for taking part in this march across Lafayette Square with President Trump the other day when the square was cleared by security and the president went to St. John's Church and held up the Bible there for what people were saying was a photo op. There's a feeling that the military presence there, with the Secretary of Defense, made it look a little bit more aggressive than it needed to be. And what we know is that Esper, who's been very publicly loyal to the president, came out today and said that he wasn't aware of why they were going into the plaza and said that he opposes the use of active duty military forces to help quell some of these protests. That goes against some of the comments President Trump has made in terms of cracking down on these protests at cities around the country.
Do we have any indication of whether President Trump, if he is upset, we don't know if he is, if he's upset, is it more about saying, I don't think we should be sending in troops, or is it more about the question of the photo op? Because the president seems to be a little defensive about that. He also said today, boy, I didn't know they were going to clear these people out before I could go across with my Bible to the church.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of both here. I was quite surprised to hear Esper even use the phrase photo op. So that's because that's been a real source of irritation with the White House. And I think the other real point of contention is not that Esper opposes the use of the troops, but that he said so publicly. I think it's clear that the Pentagon has wanted to step away from that rhetoric for a few days now. But when particularly in this administration, going very public and laying that out is often not seen in a very positive light within the Oval Office.
Yeah, and let's be clear, Secretary Esper serves at the pleasure of the president, and if the president orders it to be done, it will be done if it's lawful. There isn't much question, is there really, that the president does have the authority under that old Insurrection Act from 1807 to do this if he decides to?
He does. It's something that's been used, previously. It hasn't been used a lot in the last 50 years. I think the last time was during the Los Angeles riots in 1991. But It's certainly it's a law that's been invoked before. It would just be a controversial step to have active duty military forces patrolling American streets. It's just not something we're accustomed to seeing.
Yeah, it's fascinating. There was a piece I'm sure you saw in the Washington Post today that said at least that the leadership in the Pentagon, the civilian leadership, had ordered the Joint Chiefs, the chiefs of the Army, Navy, et cetera, not to make any comments about the shooting out of Minneapolis. Have you had any reporting on that? And is that typical? Is that normal? Because often I think the chiefs are supposed to be somewhat independent of the political apparatus, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right. I think Esper actually came out today and talked openly about the killing of George Floyd. He said it was a tragedy that happens far too often in this country, and he called it a horrible crime. But I think the Pentagon is trying to clamp down on too many public comments from lower-level officers that they worry will conflict with either an eventual mission to go into the streets or conflict with what perhaps the White House guidance is on this.
What's the next step for the White House, do you think?
Well, I think we have a 2 p.m., I believe, a White House presser. We'll be looking very closely for criticism of Esper, follow up on this meeting he's having with the president today. We believe that meeting is officially to discuss the situation in Afghanistan, but clearly with Mark Esper making these remarks right before he headed over to the White House, that's going to be a next step. And then I think, a lot will depend on how these protests unfold and whether there really is more pressure from the White House for a active duty military deployment. I think last night Washington was a little more calm, so the pressure eased on that sense. But, it's obviously very fluid and things are changing day by day.
Okay, Bill, really appreciate you taking time to join us today. That's Bill Ferries. He heads our national security team down in Washington. It's time now for Bloomberg First Word News. We go to Mark Crumpton, who has more, I understand it, on Secretary Esper. Mark?
David, thank you. As you and Bill were just alluding to, breaking with President Trump, Defense Secretary Mark Esper said today he does oppose using military forces for law enforcement in containing current street protests. Secretary Esper did refer to the Insurrection Act, which would allow the president to use active duty military and law enforcement in containing street protests.
The option to use active duty forces in a law enforcement role should only be used as a matter of last resort, and only in the most urgent and dire of situations. We are not in one of those situations now. I do not support invoking the Insurrection Act.
Secretary Esper making his comments there at the Pentagon today. He added, quote, "The National Guard is best suited for performing domestic support to civil authorities in these situations in support of local law enforcement." Pope Francis says he's deeply concerned about the social unrest in the United States. In his weekly greeting, he said racism can't be tolerated. He called the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis tragic and said he was praying for all those who have lost their lives because of, quote, the sin of racism. Iran is seeing a second wave of coronavirus infections. Officials say there were more than 3,100 new cases reported today. That's up 50% from a week earlier. 9 of Iran's 31 provinces are now considered red zones or carry a virus alert warning. Iran began relaxing lockdown measures in early April. Another sign of how relations between the United States and China are getting worse. The Trump administration has warned that it will suspend passenger flights from China if Beijing doesn't allow American carriers to re-enter the market. The coronavirus pandemic prompted flight cuts earlier this year. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg. Powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Coming up later on Balance of Power, we're going to be joined by Leon Panetta, who of course was Secretary of Defense, but also the White House Chief of Staff. We're going to talk to him about how a White House handles a cascade of crises such as this White House is facing right now. That's coming up Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's not time now for our stock of the hour. It is Warner Music Group, which went public earlier today. It had been held off for a day or so. It's gone public, and the price has actually gone up since it started trading. We are joined now by Kayla Lyons to take us through the Warner story.
Yeah, David, it started trading just over half an hour ago. Right now, the stock up the better part of 6%, trading around $28.61 a share. That's after it priced at $25 this morning, the midpoint of the marketing range. It raised about $1.93 billion, in the listing, which I should point out actually upsized 77 million shares, up from just 70 million. It makes it one of the biggest offerings we've seen so far in 2020 and values the company at nearly $13 billion. And of course, David, as you alluded to, this was delayed from yesterday to observe the music industry's Blackout Tuesday to support the protests against police brutality. In fact, it was really delayed about 3 months because of the pandemic. So the fact that this company now has come public, we're seeing it being taken pretty well by the public markets, sends a pretty positive signal about potentially renewed strength of U.S. offerings after we saw those really put on pause for a while because of this pandemic, David.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder whether it says more about the state of the equity market, which is really on its way back, or whether it says more about the state of the music market. Is the music market sort of a stay-at-home kind of business?
Well, it's a little bit of both, isn't it, right? We've seen obviously increased demand for risk on the part of investors, and it's not just a big week for Warner Music. We're about to see $6.4 billion in IPOs total this week, so definitely a revival of companies coming to the public markets. But on your point about the music industry, of course, this really is a lot about streaming. Warner Music especially is very catered towards streaming. About 70% of its revenue comes from digital sales. Spotify and Apple, for example, account for about 27% of revenue if you're looking at the last fiscal year. And the fact that everybody is homebound, we can't go out to concerts, etc., to get entertainment, likely is giving an added boost to Warner Music here.
Yeah, and let's be honest, Kayla, I've downloaded more music while I've been stuck at home. I bet you have too. So maybe it's happy days are here again for the music business, which, let's be honest, has really gone up and gone down. Initially, streaming was not too good for it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a lot of back and forth for certain. And not only is this good for the music business, but I would point out, too, that the man who really is making all the money from this IPO, Len Blavatnik, I'm totally butchering that name. You would do a far better job than I in that name. But he actually is getting 85% of the economic interest in this, 99% of the voting right. It's basically all of the proceeds from this IPO are not going to Warner Music. They're going to him, David.
Boy, that's better maybe than Mark Zuckerberg. That's a good deal. Okay, thank you so much to Kayla Lyons. Great to have you with us on Warner Music. Coming up next, he ran the Defense Department, the CIA, and also was Chief of Staff to President Clinton. Leon Panetta is here to give us his thoughts on how a government handles the sort of series of crises we're facing right now. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
The option to use active duty forces in a law enforcement role should only be used as a matter of last resort and only in the most urgent and dire of situations. We are not in one of those situations now. I do not support invoking the Insurrection Act.
That was the Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, earlier today saying that he disagreed with the president's suggestion that maybe federal troops could be sent in to quell some of the civil disobedience, to civil unrest across the country. Welcome now somebody who had that job as Secretary of Defense, as well as being Director of CIA and the Chief of Staff to President Clinton at the White House. He is Leon Panetta and the founder of the Panetta Institute for Public Policy. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us. You have been in the room when all sorts of very difficult situations were addressed. We have a remarkable situation in this country right now with not one, not two, but three crises: the pandemic, the economic collapse, and now we have the civil unrest. What is the best way for a government to address that kind of cascade of crises?
Well, I always found as Chief of Staff and then later as CIA Director and Secretary of Defense that when facing a crisis and when facing a series of crises as we are now, the best approach is to gather the National Security Council together and determine what the best strategy is to deal with each of these crises and to develop options, obviously, to present to the president, but to try to develop at least a common strategy that everybody can support and that is in the best interest of the country in terms of dealing with that crisis. So I think this is a moment when the president needs to listen to the advice of his most experienced advisors. That's critically important at a time when you're facing this kind of serious threat to the country.
Well, we heard from one senior advisor today in his Secretary of Defense, but it was public. It wasn't behind closed doors. Is there any doubt that the president has the authority, the legal authority, to send in federal troops if he so chooses? There is this Insurrection Act.
Well, look, I think it's clear that the president could assert the Insurrection Act, but again, this country has recognized that the purpose of our military is to be trained to confront foreign adversaries in combat, not to be used for riot control or law enforcement. The Posse Comitatus Act was passed in the 1800s for the purpose of making clear that the U.S. military ought not to take the place of law enforcement. And so for that reason, I commend the Secretary of Defense, Esper, for taking the position that he took, because military leaders, almost in unison, do not believe that our military ought to be used to fight our own people. It ought to be used to fight foreign enemies.
Are federal troops even trained to do this? I mean, to pick up on your point, are they trained to deal with crowd control and things like that? Because we have, sadly, in our history, seen instances where some military were brought in who were not properly trained, and we had some tragic results, such as Kent State. You know the military well. Are the federal troops, or some of the federal troops, trained to really be effective in this situation? Is this the best tool in the toolkit?
I don't believe it is, because why we train our military is to engage in combat with a foreign adversary. That's what they're trained to do. They're not trained on riot control. They're not trained on crowd control. They're not trained on law enforcement. In this country, we believe that law enforcement ought to be left to the states and local communities, and that if necessary, obviously the National Guard can support those efforts. They do get some training in that arena. But U.S. military forces are trained primarily to engage in combat with an adversary, not to fight our own people.
At the same time, we have a difficult problem here that I'm sure you appreciate, which is we have, I think, the vast majority of protesters who are peaceful, are exercising their First Amendment rights to petition for redress of grievances, but there are clearly some bad actors in some of these demonstrations who are prone to violence and trying to instigate something. But put aside the federal military as a tool, what is the best way for the government, the federal government, the state government, to sort those two things out so we maintain law and order, we protect people and property, but we also preserve the rights of those who want to peacefully protest that horrific instance out in Minneapolis?
Well, I think it would be preferable, rather than the president asserting that somehow he'll take control of the situation if others don't. I think the president ought to be offering law enforcement assistance to states and local communities so that they can, in fact, determine whether or not there are criminal elements that are trying to take advantage of these protests. That's a law enforcement issue. That's an FBI issue. That's an intelligence issue. Frankly, the federal government gets good intelligence on those that are trying to conduct those kinds of criminal activities. And so that ought to be shared with state and local law enforcement so that they can play the primary role in trying to maintain order in their communities and in their states.
Mr. Secretary, what could we as a country learn from the military on the subject of race? Put aside their active involvement in any peacekeeping missions, but the U.S. military was there ahead of a lot of the rest of the society, going back to the days of Harry S. Truman when he was president, and integrating the military. You have a much more integrated, I think, military than most companies do across the country. What have you learned from that? What could you teach society? Because goodness knows it appears we need to learn some things fast.
I think the military is a good example for the rest of the country in terms of allowing minorities, allowing others to be able to serve their country and to be part of a unit working together to accomplish a common mission. My experience is that, whether you're black or whether you're brown or whether you're a woman, that you should have the opportunity to serve this country. And that's exactly what happens in our military. We ought to be very proud of the fact that we have a broad cross-section of our citizenry that are part of our military force. And they respect each other. They operate under discipline, but they respect and work with each other, regardless of race or color or creed. And that is what the rest of our society needs to learn, that we have to work with each other, regardless of race or color or creed, and understand that first and foremost, we are all citizens of this country. We're not black, we're not white, we're not Asian. We are all American citizens who need to work and respect each other. That's the primary theme that our forefathers built into our Constitution, and frankly, that all of us have to respect if we're going to be able to have a society that truly provides equal justice for all.
And finally, Mr. Secretary, give us a sense of the role that psychology plays in addressing any of these crises such as we have, because we have issues with respect to people feeling comfortable to go back out again, to go to restaurants, to go and gather again. How do we make sure that they feel safe? How do we make sure employees feel safe? And for that matter, how do we make sure that people living in cities where there are demonstrations feel safe? What is the president's role, the governor's role in trying to restore our confidence in this society?
Well, that's the critical question that I think we're all confronting as a country. We're facing a unique set of circumstances between a pandemic that is uncertain in terms of its impact. It's already taken over 100,000 lives in our country, has shut down our economy and our jobs and our businesses. And at the same time, we have this racial issue which developed with this horrible situation with George Floyd and the knee that was placed on his neck, which I think created even greater concerns about our society and whether or not we're true to who we are as a people. I think this is a time, frankly, not to threaten, not to bully, not to yell at each other, but to do some listening to each other as to what the American people are confronting. And to understand that we really are in this together. I think de Tocqueville thought that the greatest strength in our country and the greatest trait of Americans is that we care for our community. We care for our community. I think we ought to take that value and apply it to each of these crises. We are in this together as Americans, and we have to work together. This isn't one side against the other side. The last thing we should do is to polarize this country at a time when we're facing these crises. The purpose, I think, of leadership in this country has to be to bring us together, to unify this country so that we all understand the importance of making sure not just that we preserve peace, but that we preserve the health of all Americans.
Mr. Secretary, I cannot thank you enough. Thank you so much for joining us. It was great to have you with us. That's former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta. Coming up here, we're going to talk with Jason Furman of the Kennedy School about the state of the economy. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. Well, bad economic numbers may have looked a little bit better today, with both ISM non-manufacturing numbers and ADP jobs numbers coming a little bit better than expected as we look forward to the real jobs numbers coming up on Friday. We welcome now Dr. Jason Furman. He is from the Kennedy Center up at Harvard, where he is the professor of Practice of Economic Policy, and he also was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. So welcome, Jason. Really good to have you here. How much should we get our hopes up given these economic numbers?
Well, the U.S. economy hit bottom on April 1st, and it has been reopening since then. So these numbers aren't that surprising. I expect over the next several months, we're going to see really, really good economic numbers. But even with those really, really good economic numbers, we'll still be in a very deep hole.
Well, so what do you see as the way out of that hole? We have actually some CBO numbers, I think they were coming out saying it'll take us 10 years to get the economy back to where it was before. But do we have that kind of a wait? Is it that gradual a build back up?
I think the problem is that some economic shocks there's medicine for. A demand shock, you cut taxes, you increase government spending, you cut interest rates. And we've done a lot of all of that. And as a result, for example, we protected people's incomes. Disposable personal income rose in April rather than falling. But what we're also seeing is a supply shock and a reallocation shock. And we just don't have great medicine if millions and millions of people who are laid off don't get hired back from their employers, need to find a new job, might even need to move to a different sector. And that's what I think will take such a long time to recover from.
So what could we do to make it a bit shorter? I mean, we both have Speaker Pelosi's proposal now, I think $3.5 trillion, that includes state and local aid, more disbursements directly to people, various elements of that package. And then we also have the White House now talking about maybe we should have like tax credits if you go use a restaurant or you travel. What's the most effective policy tool we have left that we haven't used?
The biggest tool that we know works that we haven't used to any substantial degree is assistance to state and local governments. They had balanced budgets before this crisis. The crisis pushed them off of that. Their tax revenues are way down. If they did a round of layoffs and spending cuts, that would compound the economic problem. So that's the most important. The other thing to understand about the CARES Act is it was basically a 4-month piece of legislation. And it expires June, July, some of it September, depending on which piece you're looking at. And the economy won't be in good enough shape by the time it expires. So another round of a lot of what was in the CARES Act will also be needed.
Explain particularly the situation with unemployment, if you will, because we now are hearing some people saying maybe we went too far, at least at the time, with some of the unemployment insurance, because it actually paid people more for being out of work than in work. As we look forward to possible extension of those benefits, should we be tapering them down somewhat so we don't have a perverse incentive?
I think tapering them down would be a good idea, but it's really important that something gets continued. With unemployment insurance, you always want to do the balance of what you're doing to protect people versus incentives to work. When the biggest problem in the economy right now is that there aren't jobs that people can do. The problem is not so much with the labor supply, it's with the labor demand. So I don't think it's causing a big problem right now. But as the unemployment rate comes down, definitely it should be tapered and ideally switch to a system that was more like you got 90%, 80% of the wages you were getting on your job rather than this fixed $600 a week.
So, Jason, let's try to address that need for labor demand, and let's go to infrastructure. We talked with the governor of New Jersey last week. He's Phil Murphy, and he said he needs a big infrastructure project. That's something Andrew Cuomo said as well. Is this a time we could actually help some of that labor demand just by a really big infrastructure project? Goodness knows we could use the infrastructure.
Yeah, the number one priority right now is the immediate relief, the relief for states and localities, for the unemployed and the like. But I think given the magnitude of the supply shock, given the magnitude of the reallocation shock, that we're going to have a job shortage in 2021, 2022, 2023 and beyond, and infrastructure is one great way to fill that. So if we take a couple extra months to do the infrastructure bill, I don't think that's tragic, but one should certainly happen.
Okay, Jason, really appreciate you being with us today. That is Dr. Jason Furman of the Kennedy School. I'm delighted to say he's going to be staying with us in the second hour of Balance of Power. We're going to talk about some of the structural inequalities, economic inequalities in the country and what we could do about them. In the meantime, here, we're going to be talking next with Bill Cassidy. He's the senator, Republican senator from Louisiana, who wants to make sure we protect the rights of people peacefully to demonstrate, but we don't allow the violence. We're going to ask him how he's going to get that done. That's on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. I think it's fair to say the big story in the United States of America this week has been the continuing civil disobedience and continuing civil unrest across the country in the wake of that terrible incident up in Minneapolis. And the question is how we can preserve the best of the peaceful protests. They have the right to do that in the First Amendment, at the same time that we weed out some of the people who clearly are in it for mischief and mayhem. We welcome now Senator Bill Cassidy. He's Republican of Louisiana. Welcome, Senator. It's great to have you with us. I know that's something that you have talked about. Do you have any thoughts about how we can do that, preserve the best of peaceful protest and not have the violence we've seen?
Yeah, we have to think about it. One, I think there's legitimate concerns that have to be addressed. I've been speaking to law enforcement back home, and one thing struck me, that when you look at the picture from New Orleans, the New Orleans Police Department is kneeling in prayer with protesters, asking divine guidance to find solutions to problems. Elsewhere, you have people rioting. Now, what is the difference? Well, among other things, as I've learned, the New Orleans Police Department has implemented a program called EPIC. Ethical policing is courageous. And if one officer has just lost it for whatever reason, the other officer, no matter what the difference in rank, of longevity, seniority, you name it, has the ability to tap the first officer on the shoulder and says, I'm taking over. In that way, there's mutual accountability. What has happened with that sort of change in training has been much greater community acceptance and cooperation, decreased complaints about the police department, but also the police themselves more satisfied, less stressed. And so I think that sort of training needs to be taken nationwide. That's what I'm talking to others about.
Boy, that sounds like a very sensible program. Let me ask you the question of the day, the moment right now, and that has to do with use of federal troops, because President Trump had said he would send them in if some states, some cities couldn't get things under control. He has Secretary of Defense today, Mark Esper, come out and say he thinks that's a bad idea. The federal troops aren't the best to get that done. You should use people trained specially for that. Do you have a view on that? Whether it's lawful or not, and most people agree it would be lawful for the president to do it, he has that right. Is it the best tool in the toolbox for this problem?
It does not seem to be the best tool. And obviously, National Guard can be called as a step before that. It does appear as if National Guard can be effective. So simple answer, does not seem to be the best tool. Acknowledging that it's been done in the past. In 1968, I think it was done again by H.W. Bush under Rodney King, but it does not seem to be the best tool now.
What about the larger underlying issues here that we've had in this country for a good long time? I'm old enough to remember 1968, 1969, and what was going on. Seems like we didn't get them fixed. Are there things that we can do, and let's be frank, Congress with the president could do to try to address some of the great and growing inequalities, economic inequalities between black and brown people on the one hand and white people on the other?
Let's back up a little bit. I think there's actually been great advance. If you think about 1968, there was no sense of ownership by those in the minority community relative to the majority community. Now we have the mayor of Atlanta saying, if you're running down the street with a stolen Gucci purse, you're not protesting George Floyd's death. You see YouTubes of Black Lives Matter members taking a young white hoodlum who appears to be a member of Antifa, breaking up stones to throw, taking him over and handing him to the police so that their anarchism does not corrupt the peaceful protest about George Floyd's death. So we've made progress. We've made a lot of progress. We have to build upon that. I would also point out that before the coronavirus, the economic recovery had risen all boats, so that African Americans had the lowest unemployment rates they had in the history of statistics. Similarly for Hispanics, similarly for veterans, for the disabled, et cetera. Now, what we need to do is build upon that. But then I go back to the next step. What happened? Everybody has economic dislocation. The idea that you're losing your job because of coronavirus and maybe at greater risk if you continue to work because of the nature of your work clearly is going to add stress to the society. So we need to address the underlying racism and brutality that is still evident in some communities. Absolutely. We have to show one another that we care for each other. Absolutely. Root out the violence that infiltrates a peaceful movement. Absolutely. But go back to that economic prosperity that rises all ships in a way which addresses inequality. That's where we have to also have a component. One more thing, you got to also take care of coronavirus, because right now that's doing a lot to precipitate the uncertainty that we were describing.
Yeah, so well said. Thank you so much. It's easy to forget how well some of the poorest among us were doing before this coronavirus. Thank you so much. That is Senator Bill Cassidy, Republican of Louisiana. That does it for the television portion of Balance of Power. We'll continue on radio for the second hour. We're going to talk again with Jason Furman about inequality, as well as with the Massachusetts Attorney General. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.